She cooked every meal, scrubbed every floor, and kept this family alive through 3 Wyoming winters. And on Thanksgiving night, they handed her a plate and pointed to the door. Not a chair at the table she had built. Not a word of thanks. Just the cold. If you've ever given everything to people who treated you like nothing, stay with me. Because Clara Whitmore's story doesn't end in that frozen yard. It ends somewhere none of them ever expected. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the Laramie Range the way it always did in late November. Not as a gradual cooling, but as a flat, deliberate wall of cold that found every gap in your clothing and settled there like it had a right to. Clara Whitmore had lived in Wyoming long enough to stop being surprised by it. 31 years on this land had taught her that the cold didn't care whether you were ready or not. It arrived on its own schedule, and you either prepared for it or you suffered. She had prepared. She always prepared. By 4 o'clock that morning, while the rest of the Whitmore household lay under quilts and down, Clara was already in the kitchen. The wood stove needed feeding first. It always needed feeding first, and she crouched in the dark and worked the damper with hands that had grown so accustomed to early cold that they barely registered it anymore. The iron handle burned faintly, the way it did when the overnight fire had gone down to coals, and she built it back up with split pine before the larger oak logs went on, working by feel and memory rather than lamp. Because lighting a lamp this early meant someone might wake and find something to criticize before she'd had 10 minutes of silence. She had learned to value silence the way some people valued money. The turkey had been brining since Tuesday. She'd selected it herself from the pen out back, not the largest bird because the largest was stringy, and the Whitmore family did not appreciate having to chew their holiday meals, something she had learned the hard way 2 Thanksgivings ago when Dora had pushed the platter away and said the meat was tough and dry. Which it wasn't, but no one had contradicted her. Clara had salted it herself, spiced the brine herself, wrapped cheesecloth around the breast herself. She did everything herself. That was simply the arrangement, though no one had ever formally proposed it or asked whether she'd agreed. She had not agreed. She had simply never been asked. The Whitmore family, her family, though the word had started to feel hollow in her mouth in recent years, occupied the farmhouse in the particular way of people who believe that a house runs itself. There was Dora, who was 63 and had been married to Clara's late Uncle Edmund for 22 years before he passed, and who had assumed in the aftermath of his death that she had inherited not just the property, but the woman who maintained it. There were Dora's 2 sons from a previous marriage, Gerald and Pat, both of whom had the same broad shoulders and the same narrow capacity for gratitude. Gerald's wife, Ruth, was pleasant enough in the distracted way of a woman who has decided that getting along with everyone is easier than having an opinion. Their children, 3 of them, ranging from 8 to 14, were loud in the way that children are when no one has ever told them that other people's quiet matters too. And then there was Clara. Clara was 54 years old, though people who didn't know better sometimes guessed younger, which she attributed to the fact that hard work keeps the body from having the luxury of aging slowly. She had a face that had been weathered into something more interesting than pretty. Strong jaw, gray threading through dark hair she kept pinned without much ceremony, hands that were capable rather than delicate. She had come to the Whitmore farm at 23, after her parents died within 6 months of each other, invited by her Uncle Edmund in the sincere way that good men invite family when they see family struggling. She had meant to stay a year. Edmund had died 8 years later, and somehow a year had become 31, and the door she might have walked back through had quietly sealed itself while she wasn't paying attention. Dora had made sure of that, not in any dramatic way. Dora was not a dramatic woman. She was methodical, which is a more dangerous thing. She had simply made herself indispensable to Clara's sense of obligation, one small request at a time. Edmund would have wanted you to stay and help me through this first winter, then the second winter. Then the children arrived, and someone needed to manage the household while Dora grieved, which Dora did at length and with impressive dedication. Then there was always something: a bad harvest year, Ruth's difficult pregnancy, Gerald's back injury, the roof that needed fixing. There was always a reason, carefully presented, why Clara leaving would be a betrayal. Clara had believed her. More precisely, she had wanted to believe that staying was a choice made from love rather than from the slow erosion of believing you had nowhere else to go. By the time she understood the difference, she had spent so many years here that the understanding came with a bone-deep exhaustion that made action feel impossible. She rolled out the pie crust by lamplight. 2 pumpkin, 1 apple, 1 sweet potato because the children preferred it to pumpkin, though nobody had ever actually asked Clara what she preferred. She made herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window for exactly 4 minutes. She had learned to measure her stolen moments, watching the dark thin out over the ridgeline to the east while the house slept around her. Then she went back to work. Dora came downstairs at 7:30 in the quilted robe that Clara had repaired twice in the past year, both times without being thanked. She surveyed the kitchen with the expression of someone inspecting a property rather than entering a home. "You started the biscuits yet?" "They're rising," Clara said. She didn't turn from the stove. "Edmund always liked the biscuits buttery." "I know how Edmund liked his biscuits, Dora." A pause. Not quite long enough to be a confrontation, not short enough to be agreement. Dora poured herself coffee from the pot Clara had brewed and carried it toward the parlor. "Ruth said she might want gravy on the side this year. Separate boat." "I always do gravy in a separate boat." "I'm just passing along what she said." Clara lifted the lid on the turkey baste and said nothing. There was a particular kind of communication in this house that had nothing to do with the words used. A whole grammar of small provocations and small surrenders that Clara had become fluent in against her will. She understood that the comment about the gravy boat was not about gravy at all. It was about reminding Clara that other people's preferences mattered and hers did not. A point that had been made so many times over so many years that it had stopped requiring a particular occasion. The boys came down an hour later, Gerald first, then Pat, and they filled the kitchen the way large men fill small spaces, without awareness that they were doing it. Gerald helped himself to coffee, looked around the kitchen at the considerable evidence of a morning's worth of labor, and said, "Smells good in here?" which was the most he had ever said about Clara's cooking in 11 years of eating it. Pat said nothing at all. He sat at the table and opened the newspaper Gerald had brought from Cody 2 days ago, and read it as though he were alone in the room. Ruth came down with the children trailing her like ducklings, and immediately began reorganizing the things Clara had arranged on the counter. Not because they needed reorganizing, but because Ruth could not enter a kitchen without touching things. "Oh, I thought we'd put the serving pieces out on the sideboard this year," Ruth said. "They're always on the sideboard." "I just meant, well, maybe we could try something different." "The serving pieces are on the sideboard," Clara said, "where they've been every Thanksgiving for 12 years. Ruth retreated into a smile that didn't involve her eyes and took the children into the parlor. Clara heard Dora say something in a low voice that she didn't catch, and Ruth laugh in the bright, practiced way that women laugh when they're agreeing with something they know isn't entirely kind. Clara turned back to the stove. "What?" By 2 in the afternoon, the farmhouse smelled like something that should have been the center of something good. The turkey was out of the oven and resting under cloth. The pies were cooled and set. The biscuits were ready to go in for their final rise. The gravy was done, in a separate boat, which sat on the counter in mute testimony to the fact that it had always been in a separate boat. And the sweet potatoes were mashed the way the children liked them, with more butter than Clara thought was wise, but with the patience of a woman who has learned to release small battles. She had not eaten since the coffee at dawn. She had not sat down since the coffee at dawn. Her back registered this more than her feet, which had gone past the kind of pain that complains and into the quieter territory of endurance. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the light change over the yard and thought about what it might feel like to sit at a table that someone else had set. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. She wasn't sure it had ever happened, not here. Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing the good dress she saved for holidays, dark green with the ivory collar, and looked at the table Clara had spent 30 minutes arranging. "We're going to need you to take your plate outside today." Clara didn't move. For a moment she simply held very still, the way you hold still when you're trying to determine whether you heard something correctly. "I'm sorry?" "Chester Hartwell is coming," Dora said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "And the Pruitts." That's 10 at the table, and we only have 9 place settings that match. And honestly, Clara, it just makes more sense. You know how things are with company coming. I set this table, Clara said. I cooked this meal. I've been awake since 4 in the morning. I know you have, and we all appreciate that. Do you? Dora's chin came up. Excuse me? Do you appreciate it, Dora? It was not quite a question. Because I've been preparing this house for 31 years, and I don't believe I've heard that word used sincerely once in the last decade. The kitchen went very quiet. Gerald, who had drifted into the doorway behind Dora, went still with his glass halfway to his mouth. Ruth appeared behind him with an expression that was difficult to read, some mixture of discomfort and something almost like relief, as though a thing she had long suspected was finally happening in front of her eyes. We're not having this conversation today, Dora said, in the voice she used to close rooms. We are, Clara said. Because I'm not eating in the yard like a dog, Dora. I've never done it before, and I'm not doing it today. The Hartwells. I don't care about the Hartwells. I care that I have been in this kitchen since before sunrise, making a meal for 12 people, and you are standing in this doorway asking me to take my plate outside and eat alone in the November cold. Clara. Gerald's voice had the warning note of a man who doesn't want trouble. She looked at him. You want to weigh in, Gerald? You're welcome to. Tell me honestly. When's the last time you thanked me for anything? He didn't answer. Men like Gerald rarely did. Not because they were cruel, but because they had simply never been required to think about it, which amounts to the same damage in the end. I'll leave before I eat outside, Clara said. She meant it. She could hear in her own voice that she meant it, which surprised her slightly, the way your own certainty can surprise you when you've been uncertain for a long time. Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly and without warmth, You have nowhere to go. The room took that in. Ruth looked at the floor. Gerald turned his glass in his hand. From the parlor came the sound of the children's voices, oblivious. Clara thought, she might be right. She has been right for years. That's how this has worked. And then she thought, but I'm not eating outside. She picked up her plate, the one she had fixed herself, smaller than what she would serve anyone else at this table, because she had learned to take less without thinking about it. And she walked to the back door. Not because she was surrendering, not because Dora had won, but because the conversation inside this kitchen, with these walls, had nowhere left to go, and she needed to think. She would think better in the cold. She always had. The wind had died down to something almost manageable, though the temperature had dropped into the low 20s and her breath came in thin clouds that the air absorbed immediately. She stood on the back step and looked out at the yard she had maintained for 31 years. The kitchen garden plot, bare now and frost-silvered, the chopped wood stacked against the barn wall. The fence she had mended last spring with wire she'd purchased herself because no one else had gotten around to it. The land went out past the fence line into the pale brown distance of a Wyoming November, flat and wide and cold, and Clara stood in it and held her plate and felt, for the first time in many years, the specific quality of her own solitude. Not loneliness exactly. Something more like clarity, the kind that comes when you stop pretending. She did not cry. She had done her crying privately over the years, in the small hours when the house was asleep, and she was not going to do it now in her own yard in the cold with a turkey leg cooling in her hands. She was 54 years old, and she had built this farm as much as any of them, more than any of them. And she was standing on ground that had been watered with her labor for 3 decades, and she would not cry. She sat down on the chopping block near the wood stack because it was the only thing to sit on out here, and she set her plate on her knees and she looked at the food she had cooked and thought about how it would taste cold. She heard the sound of a horse and wagon coming up the track from the road before she saw it. A deliberate, unhurried sound, a working animal rather than a show one. Then the wagon itself came into view around the corner of the barn. A solid rig with a man on the seat who handled the reins without thinking about it, the way people handle reins when they've been doing it since childhood. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He pulled the horse up and looked at her, not with the quick, polite non-look that people give women in difficult moments when they want to pretend they haven't noticed, but with a long, direct, considering look that was not unkind. Then he looked at the back door of the farmhouse. Then he looked back at her. You eating out here? He asked. His voice was flat and without ceremony, the kind of voice that doesn't dress things up. Apparently, Clara said. He studied that for a moment. Then he wrapped the reins around the brake handle, climbed down from the wagon with the careful movement of a man who has had hard miles on his body, and walked over to where she was sitting. Colton Mercer, he said. I've got a timber deal with the family here. Clara Whitmore. He looked at the back step, then at the chopping block. Then he went to the barn wall and dragged over a hay bale with no particular ceremony and sat down on it, a few feet away from her. Cold out, he said. Yes, she said. Turkey smells good from here? I'd imagine it does. I started it at 4 this morning. He nodded slowly. He had the kind of face that had been left out in the weather long enough to become permanent. Not old, but seasoned, somewhere in his mid-50s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested more squinting at distance than laughing, though she couldn't be certain which it was yet. They know you're out here? He asked. They put me here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, huh, in the particular way that people say huh when they understand exactly what they've been told and are deciding what they think about it. The wind came across the yard and Clara pulled her coat tighter. Her plate was cooling fast. She picked up a fork and ate a bite of the sweet potatoes she had mashed this morning, which were good even cold, and said nothing. Colton Mercer sat on his hay bale in the yard of a stranger and waited, apparently in no particular hurry to go inside and conduct his timber business, and Clara did not ask him why because she was beginning to understand that some things don't need to be asked. The farmhouse door opened. She heard Dora's voice before she saw her. Mr. Mercer, we've been expecting you. Evening, he said without getting up. A pause. Perhaps you'd like to come inside out of the cold? I'm all right here for now, Colton said. Had a long ride. Could use a minute. Another pause. Longer this time. Clara could feel Dora calculating at the door. Clara, Dora said with the particular controlled pleasantness of a woman managing a situation, why don't you come in and set another place? No, thank you, Clara said. The door closed. Not slammed. Dora didn't slam doors, but with a firmness that made its point. Colton looked at the door. Then he looked back at the yard, at the kitchen garden and the stacked wood, and the fence that ran straight because someone had put in the work to make it straight. He looked at these things with the attentive eyes of a man who knows what maintained land looks like, and who knows that it doesn't maintain itself. You do all this? He asked. Most of it. He was quiet for a moment, then, how long? 31 years. He absorbed that the way you absorb something that requires absorbing. Not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of recognition. As if the number confirmed something he'd suspected from the moment he'd pulled into the yard and seen a woman eating alone on a chopping block in the November cold. They sat in the quiet together for a while. The light was going out of the sky in the way it does in late November in Wyoming, fast and without much ceremony. The colors compressing from gold to gray in the space of 20 minutes. Clara finished what she could of her plate and set it on the ground. The food had been good. She knew it had been good. That fact mattered to her, independent of everything else. You staying on after tonight? Colton asked. I don't know yet, she said, which was more honest than anything she had said inside. He nodded, as if that were a reasonable answer. My offer to buy the timber right stands regardless. Wanted you to know that. She looked at him. Why would that matter to me? He met her eyes. Because I've got a feeling it might matter a great deal, he said, depending on how some things shake out. She didn't know what he meant. She told herself she didn't know what he meant, but something in her chest had shifted in the last 30 minutes. Some arrangement of weight that had been sitting in the same position for years had moved slightly, the way a stone moves when water finally gets underneath it. And she was not quite the same woman who had walked out this back door with her own plate in her own hands, while her family finished setting the table inside. The farmhouse windows were warm and yellow in the dusk. She could hear voices inside. Dora's smooth hostess tone, Gerald's rumble, the children shrieking about something, the sounds of her life, viewed from outside it. Clara looked at them for a long time. Then she looked away. The hay bale Colton Mercer had dragged over from the barn wall was not comfortable. He had sat on worse. Saddle leather so old it had gone hard as wood, railroad ties, the frozen ground itself on a night in Montana when the fire had gone out and he'd been too tired to rebuild it. But the bale was not comfortable, and he was aware of it in the way that a man becomes aware of discomfort when he chooses it deliberately. He had chosen to sit here. He could have gone inside 20 minutes ago when Dora Whitmore opened that back door with her smooth hostess voice and her careful eyes, and he had not, and he was clear on why. He had seen something when he pulled into this yard. Not just a woman eating alone in the cold, though that was enough on its own to stop him. He had seen the stack of firewood against the barn, split clean, stacked with the kind of care that means someone has been doing it long enough to do it right without thinking. He had seen the fence line running straight across the near pasture, the rails seated properly, no sag. He had seen the kitchen garden, dormant now, but laid out in the measured way of someone who understands soil and plans ahead. He had seen all of this before he ever saw Clara Whitmore sitting on the chopping block with her plate on her knees. And then he had seen her, and the two things had connected in his mind without effort. This place runs because of her. He didn't say this out loud. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud to a woman you'd met 4 minutes ago, sitting in her own yard in the cold after her own family had put her there. Some observations you keep to yourself until you understand more about what you're looking at. Clara had finished what she could eat of her plate. She'd set it on the frozen ground without much ceremony, and now she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance in the way of a person who is thinking hard about something and doesn't particularly want to be interrupted. He respected that. He had spent enough time around people who couldn't tolerate silence to appreciate the ones who could. The farmhouse windows threw yellow rectangles across the yard. Inside, he could hear the low architecture of a family gathering, voices building over each other, the sound of something being set down too hard on a table, a child's brief shriek that resolved into laughter. The ordinary sounds of people who had no idea or didn't care that they were being ordinary at someone else's expense. "They're going to send someone out here again," he said. Clara didn't look at him. "Probably. Gerald most likely, or the other one. Pat." She said it without inflection. "Pat doesn't like confrontation. It'll be Gerald." She was right. 3 minutes later, the back door opened, and Gerald Whitmore came out with his coat half-buttoned against the cold. A big man carrying his bulk with the slight forward lean of someone who expects to take up more space than he's given. He looked at Colton first, an assessment, brief and not particularly friendly, and then at Clara. "Mama wants to know if you're coming in," he said. "Your mother knows the answer to that," Clara said. Gerald's jaw worked. He was not a man who had been told no very often, at least not by women who lived in his house, and his face showed the effort of processing it. He looked at Colton again as if looking for some male solidarity on the question. Some shared understanding that women in difficult moods are a weather event you wait out. Colton looked back at him without offering anything. "Mr. Mercer," Gerald said, shifting. "We've got the papers inside. Whenever you're ready." "I'll be in shortly," Colton said. "Need a few more minutes." Gerald's eyes moved between them. Something flickered across his face. Suspicion, or maybe something simpler, like the discomfort of a man who has done something he knows was wrong and has just been made to stand in front of it. He went back inside without another word. The door closed with the same careful firmness as before. Clara let out a slow breath. "You don't have to sit out here on my account." "I know that. Your deal with Gerald will keep." He looked at her. "Does this happen often?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone deciding whether to answer, but the hesitation of someone deciding how much truth to use. "Not exactly like this, but variants of it. 31 years of variants." "Something like that." He turned that over. The wind came across the yard again, sharper now, and he pulled his coat collar up. Clara hadn't moved. She sat in the cold with the same stillness she'd had since he arrived, and he had the sense that she had made her body stop registering cold the way people make their bodies stop registering a lot of things when they've had to endure them long enough. "Where would you have gone?" he asked. "If you'd left, before tonight." She looked at him then, a direct measuring look that reminded him she was not a woman to underestimate, regardless of where she was sitting or what had put her here? That's a personal question for someone I met 20 minutes ago. It is, he agreed. You don't have to answer it. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the yard. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. I don't know. And Dora knows I don't know, which is why she said it. He nodded. He understood that particular architecture of power. The way people use your uncertainty against you, name it out loud like a sentence being passed, confident that naming it will make you stay still. He had seen it in business dealings more than once. A man who knows you have no other buyer quotes you whatever price he wants. What did you do before you came here, Vaughn? He asked. Before the 31 years? I grew up in Cheyenne. My father ran a dry goods store. She paused. I can keep books. I used to help him with the accounts before he got sick. I can cook, obviously. I know enough about livestock to get by. She said it like a list being read from memory. Not proud, not humble, just accurate. I know how to work. That's never been the question. What has been the question? She looked at him. Whether working is enough to make you worth keeping around, or just keeping. The distinction landed between them and sat there. Colton was quiet for a moment, and then he said, There's a difference. Yes, Clara said. There is. He went inside eventually. He had to. The timber deal was legitimate business, and he had ridden 2 hours from Cody to conduct it, and sitting on a hay bale in a Wyoming yard until full dark served no one. But he went inside with a clearer understanding of the house he was entering than he'd had when he arrived, and clarity, in his experience, was worth the cold. The interior of the Whitmore farmhouse was warm and well kept, in the particular way of houses where someone has taken consistent care of things. The floors were clean, the woodwork was sound, the curtains were straight. There were small evidences of attention everywhere. A replaced hinge on the parlor door, a repaired section of baseboard near the kitchen threshold, a window latch that had been recently tightened. Colton noticed these things the way he noticed the fence line and the wood stack, which is to say automatically, because he had spent enough years working with his hands that evidence of work was as legible to him as words on a page. Dora Whitmore stood near the fireplace in her green dress with her composed face and her careful smile, and she extended her hand and thanked him for coming, and he shook her hand and said the appropriate things while his eyes moved around the room. Gerald was behind her and Pat near the window, and the Chester Hartwells had arrived, a banker type and his wife, dressed slightly better than the occasion required, the way people dress when they want you to know they could dress better. Can I get you something? Dora offered. We have... I ate, Colton said, which was not exactly true, but close enough. Gerald spread the timber survey papers on the table, and Colton sat down and looked at them with the attention they required. It was a reasonable deal on its face. Access to the North Timber Stand for 3 seasons, a per-cord rate that wasn't what he would have chosen, but wasn't offensive. He asked his questions. Gerald answered them with the slightly too confident manner of a man who is prepared but not as thoroughly as he believes. Pat added nothing. Chester Hartwell offered an unsolicited opinion about timber prices that Colton absorbed without responding to, because it was wrong and correcting it would take longer than ignoring it. He was aware of the back door. He was aware that Clara had not come in. Ruth appeared from the kitchen with a plate of something and offered it around, and Dora directed the conversation toward the meal. How successful it had been, how many hours it had taken to prepare. We all pitched in, she said, with the serene ease of someone who has made a false statement so many times it has taken on the quality of belief. Colton looked at her. Miss Whitmore cooked most of it. A fractional pause. Clara helps, yes. She's been part of this household a long time. Part of it, he said. Not a question. She's family, Dora said with finality, in the tone that family gets used as when what is actually meant is she stays because we allow it. He looked at the papers in front of him and said nothing more about it, because he was not in this house to make moral arguments to a woman who had not asked for any. He had met Dora Whitmore's type before. Not cruel exactly, not the kind who enjoys suffering, just the kind who is very skilled at not seeing the suffering they cause, because seeing it would require them to change something, and change is expensive. He signed the preliminary agreement and folded his copy and put it in his coat. I'll have the full contract drawn up in Cody by end of next week, he said. My attorney will send it out. Excellent, Gerald said, with the expansive relief of a man who has successfully concluded something and wants everyone to know it. Colton stood. He looked around the room once more, at the maintained house, at the straight curtains, at the repaired hinge on the parlor door. And then he looked at Dora. You have a well-kept property, he said. Thank you, she said smoothly. It takes real work to keep something like this running for 30 years. He let that sit for exactly a beat. Someone should be proud of it. He did not look at Dora when he said someone. He didn't need to. He got his hat from the hook by the door and went out the front around the side of the house, back to where his horse was tied. He could hear the family resuming behind him, voices picking back up, Gerald's rumble, the children's noise. And then he heard the back door and he stopped. Clara came around the corner of the house with her coat pulled tight and her plate gone, which meant she'd left it in the yard or taken it inside quietly while he was occupied with the papers. Her face in the gray last light was composed in the way of someone who has been composing their face for a long time, but her eyes were doing something different, something that was not grief exactly, but was in the same territory. You're leaving, she said. Tonight, yes. I'm back in Cody by dark if I push. He looked at her. You going in? In a while. She wrapped her arms around herself, a practical gesture against the cold rather than a self-comforting one. Mr. Mercer. Colton. Colton. She said it like she was deciding whether it fit. You didn't have to sit out there. I know. And you didn't have to say what you said in there about the property. Also know that. She looked at him with those direct eyes. Why did you? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than reaching for the easy answer. Because I've done business in a lot of places, he said. And I've learned that the health of a property tells you who's actually running it, and people who actually run things ought to be named. Clara held his gaze for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of frost and pine from somewhere uphill. It doesn't change anything, she said, and it wasn't self-pity. She was just being accurate, the way she'd been accurate about everything else. Me being named doesn't change what this is. Maybe not tonight, he said. She looked at him carefully. Something in his tone had shifted slightly. Not much, but enough to catch. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment. He had not planned to say anything about the documents tonight. It wasn't the time, and he needed to be certain before he said anything at all, because certainty mattered in legal questions more than it mattered almost anywhere else. But she was standing in front of him in the cold asking a direct question, and she had been lied to by indirection for a long time, and he was not built for useful vagueness. I did a title search before I came out here, he said. Standard practice before I negotiate any land deal. I wanted to know who I was actually dealing with. He paused. There were some things in the county records I didn't expect to find. Clara went very still. What kind of things? Things I need to look at again more carefully before I say anything definitive. He held her eyes. I don't want to tell you something until I'm sure it's right. But you found something. I found something, he said. Yes? The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than most silences in this yard had been tonight. Clara stood in it without pushing him, without demanding more than he'd offered, and he respected that. The discipline of someone who has learned not to reach for things until she knows they're real. How long before you're sure? She asked. Few days. I'll ride back out when I've looked at everything properly. She nodded slowly. Her face had not changed exactly, but there was something moving behind her eyes that was not quite hope, something more careful than hope, something that had learned to stay small until it had reason to grow. All right, she said. He untied his horse and swung up with the stiffness of a long day in the saddle already on him. He looked down at her from the height of the horse, and she looked back up at him without flinching. This woman in her coat in the cold who had cooked a meal for 12 people starting at 4 in the morning and had been made to eat it alone in a frozen yard, who had run this property for 31 years and had never once, as far as he could tell, been thanked for it in any way that cost the thankers anything. Miss Whitmore, he said. Clara. Clara. He settled the reins. Go inside. When I'm ready, she said. He almost smiled at that. Almost. He turned his horse toward the track and rode out of the yard the way he'd come in, deliberate, unhurried, and did not look back because looking back would have made it something it wasn't yet. Clara stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded down the track. The cold had gotten serious in the last hour. Real cold, the kind that means it, and she could feel it working through her coat at the shoulders. She should go inside. She knew she should go inside. She stood in the yard for a few more minutes anyway. Things I need to look at again more carefully. She turned that over the way you turn something over when you don't want to get ahead of yourself, but you can't quite help it. A title search. County records. She knew enough from her father's business years to understand what those words meant in the context of land and what they could mean, and she did not let herself follow that thread further than she could verify, because she had spent 31 years in this house, and she understood that hope without a foundation under it was just another way of making the fall worse. But something had happened tonight that had not happened in a very long time. A stranger had pulled into her yard and seen what she was, and had chosen to sit with her in the cold rather than go inside where it was warm and polished and smelled like the meal she had cooked. He had not rescued her. She had not needed rescuing. He had simply refused to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. And in a life built largely around other people's careful not seeing, that refusal was a more remarkable thing than it might have seemed from the outside. The back door opened and Ruth came out with a lamp, walking carefully across the frozen yard. "Clara," she said, "it's getting cold." "I know." Ruth stopped a few feet away. She held the lamp in a way that illuminated more of her own face than the yard, the uncertain eyes, the set of her mouth that was working toward something. "I want to say—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know Dora was going to do that with the plate." Clara looked at her. "But you didn't say anything." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, and to her credit, she didn't dress it up. "I didn't." "All right," Clara said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." Clara looked at the farmhouse windows, yellow and warm against the dark. Being sorry is something. It's not enough, but it's something. Ruth nodded, once, like a woman receiving a verdict she knew was fair. She held the lamp out slightly, an offering of light, if not of more than that, and after a moment Clara walked past her toward the house. She went in through the back door. Her door, she thought, her kitchen, her floors, and she hung her coat on the hook and stood for a moment in the warm dark of the kitchen that smelled like the meal she had made this morning. The sounds of the dinner party reached her from the parlor. Conversation, silverware, one of the children complaining about something with a persistence that no one seemed to be addressing. Clara ran water into the sink and began to wash the serving pieces. Her hands moved through the familiar work, and her mind moved through the less familiar territory of a question she had not allowed herself to ask in many years. What if something were different? She washed the gravy boat, the separate boat, and set it in the drying rack, and did not answer the question yet. But she did not put it away either. She did not sleep well that night. Clara lay in the narrow room at the back of the house that she had occupied for so long. The mattress had learned the shape of her, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the farmhouse settle around her. The old timbers contracted in the cold the way they always did, small pops and shifts running through the walls like the house was talking to itself, and she had slept through that sound for 31 years without noticing it. Tonight she noticed everything. The draft at the window she had been meaning to recaulk since September. The faint creak of the floorboard outside her door where the joist had gone soft and someone needed to pull the board and sister the joist before the whole section gave way. She had been the someone for so long that the distinction between noticing a problem and being responsible for it had ceased to exist for her. Things I need to look at again more carefully. She turned over and faced the wall and told herself to sleep, and did not sleep. What Colton Mercer had found, or thought he'd found, she corrected herself because he had been careful to say he wasn't certain yet, could be any number of things. A surveying discrepancy, an old lien, a recording error in the county books, which were kept by human hands and therefore imperfect. She had spent enough years in her father's back office watching him work through land records for neighboring properties to understand that title documents were not clean, simple things. They were accumulated history, full of the sediment of transactions and corrections and errors, and occasionally of deliberate obscurities. She turned over again. The deliberate obscurities were what she kept coming back to. Not errors, not accidents, things I didn't expect to find. That was what he'd said. And a man who did title searches regularly, who rode out to examine records before negotiating land deals as a matter of standard practice. Such a man would have a calibrated sense of the difference between the unexpected and the merely irregular. At some point she slept, because at some point she woke, and the window was gray with early light, and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of the morning after a gathering, when the guests are gone and the family lies dispersed in their rooms, sleeping off the food and the performance of being together. Clara got up and dressed in the cold and went to the kitchen and built the fire back up and made coffee and did not think about anything in particular for the 20 minutes it took the kitchen to warm enough that she could feel her feet. Then she thought about it. She thought about Edmund. Edmund Whitmore had been a decent man in the way that some men are decent, genuinely, without effort, because it had never occurred to him to be otherwise. He had invited her here because she was family and she was struggling, and he believed that family helped family when it could. He had been kind to her in the uncomplicated way of a man who does not calculate his kindness. He had told her once, in the second year she was here, that she was the hardest working person he knew and that the farm was better for her being in it. And she had believed him because Edmund had not been a man who said things he did not mean. He had died 11 years after she arrived. Heart in the night, without warning. The kind of death that doesn't give you time to arrange what you're leaving behind, to make sure the right people know the right things. She had been the one who found him in the morning. She had been the one who sat with him until the doctor came. She had been the one who told Dora, who had been staying in Cheyenne with her sister for the week, and she had stayed on the line of that telephone long after Dora stopped speaking, holding the receiver, listening to the empty wire. That was 20 years ago. She poured her coffee and held the cup and watched the morning come in through the kitchen window, and she thought about what Edmund might have left behind that she didn't know about, and whether Dora had known. And she thought about these things in the careful, controlled way of a woman who has learned not to let herself want something until she has evidence it exists. Colton came back on a Tuesday, 5 days after Thanksgiving. She saw the wagon from the kitchen window and recognized the horse before she recognized the man, which told her more about the state of her attention in the past 5 days than she was entirely comfortable with. She set down the bread she was kneading and wiped her hands on her apron and went to the back door. He came around to the back of the house without going to the front first, which meant he was coming to find her specifically, which meant something. He was carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had been through 20 years of hard use and a rolled paper under his arm, and his face had the composed, careful expression of a man who has something to say and is thinking about how to say it correctly. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She held the door. "Come in." He came into the kitchen and looked around it with the same attentive eyes he'd brought to the yard a week ago, taking in the flour on the board, the rising dough, the coffee on the stove. She poured him a cup without asking, and he took it and sat down at the kitchen table with the satchel in front of him and the rolled paper beside it. "Is anyone home?" he asked. "Dora's in the parlor. Gerald and Pat are in town. Ruth took the children to her mother's for the week." She sat across from him. "Why?" "Because what I have to tell you, you should probably hear before they do." He set his hands flat on the satchel. "And because I wanted to give you time to think before it becomes a conversation with all of them in the room." Something in her chest tightened. She kept her face steady. "Go ahead." He opened the satchel and laid 3 documents on the table. They were copies. She could see they were handwritten copies, careful ones, the kind you make when you want a record of your own. "I went to the county recorder's office in Cody the day after Thanksgiving," he said. "And then I went to Cheyenne because some of the original filings would be at the state level." "Cheyenne," she said. "That was 4 hours by rail. I wanted to be certain." He smoothed the first document. "Edmund Whitmore purchased this property, the farmhouse and the surrounding 40 acres, in 1871. You know that." "Yes." "What you may not know is that he updated his property disposition in 1882. He turned the document so she could read it. 8 years before he died. He had it filed with the county recorder and a copy registered with the state land office." He looked at her. He left the farmhouse and 40 acres to you, Clara. Not to Dora. Not to Gerald or Pat. To you by name. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at the document. Her eyes moved across it, but the words were not organizing themselves into meaning in the normal way. They kept scattering, requiring her to read the same line twice. She saw her name. Clara Ann Whitmore, niece formerly of Cheyenne. She saw the date, March 14th, 1882. She saw Edmund's signature, which she recognized because she had seen it on enough farm ledgers and correspondence over the years to know the particular forward lean of it, the looped W. "This is real," she said. Not a question. "It's real. I had 2 attorneys look at it, one in Cody, one in Cheyenne. The filing is legitimate. The signatures are witnessed and notarized. Edmund Whitmore legally transferred property rights to you in 1882, and those rights never changed hands after that because you never signed anything transferring them away." He paused. "Did you ever sign anything? Any document related to the property after Edmund died?" She thought. Her mind moved back over 20 years of paperwork, feed bills, supply orders, the occasional correspondence with the county about the road easement. "No," she said slowly. "Dora handled everything after Edmund. She said it was easier because she understood the finances." "Did you ever question that?" She stopped. The honest answer was complicated. "I questioned it in the way you question things when you're 23 and you've just lost your family and you're living in someone else's house, and the alternative to trusting them feels like stepping off a ledge." She looked at the document. "And then I stopped questioning it." Colton was quiet for a moment. "Dora has been filing the property taxes in her own name since Edmund died," he said, "paying them from the estate accounts. There's nothing illegal about that technically, because the tax records don't convey ownership, but she has been presenting herself as the property owner in all dealings with the county for 20 years. "She knew," Clara said. The words came out flat and even, which was not what she was feeling, but what she was feeling was too large and too specific to let out in a kitchen with someone she had known for less than 2 weeks. She knew about the document. She would have known. Edmund would have told her, or she would have found the copy in his papers after he died. He kept his voice measured. "I'm not going to tell you what her intentions were, but I can tell you that the original filing is in the county record. It has been there since 1882, and no one appears to have told you it existed." Clara set her hands on the table. She looked at them, flour still in the creases of her knuckles from the bread dough. Her hands. In her kitchen, on her table, in her house, on her land, which she had worked for 31 years under the assumption that it belonged to someone else. 15 years, she said. "What?" "Edmund died in 1890. It's 1905. She looked up. "For 15 years I have been living in my own home without knowing it." Colton held her eyes. He did not say anything to soften it, which was the right decision. There was nothing to soften it with. The parlor door opened. Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway in her day dress, with her composed face and her careful eyes, and she looked at Colton first and then at Clara and then at the document spread on the kitchen table, and something shifted in her expression, something small and quick that she controlled almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I didn't know you were here." "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore." He did not stand. Dora's eyes moved to the documents. Her face had resettled into its usual controlled arrangement, but her hands, which she held clasped in front of her, had tightened. Clara noticed this because she had spent 31 years in proximity to Dora and knew her body's small languages better than Dora might have liked. "What's all this?" Dora said, with the bright neutrality of someone who knows exactly what it is. "Documents from the county recorder's office," Colton said, "and from the state land office in Cheyenne." Dora came into the kitchen slowly, the way you enter a room when you're deciding on your approach while you walk. She looked at the documents without touching them. Clara watched her face and saw her read her own husband's signature and her own name's absence and Clara's name's presence, and saw her make the calculation. How much does he know? How much does she know? What angle is still open? "Those are very old documents," Dora said. "They are," Colton agreed. legal documents, filed properly, witnessed, and notarized. Edmund was, he had some ideas about things near the end that weren't entirely. She stopped. He wasn't well in his last years. He made this filing 8 years before he died, Clara said. He was well in 1882. Dora looked at her. They had not looked at each other directly like this in a long time. Not with everything on the table between them, no household task or social occasion or daily friction to look at instead. Clara held it. She had a great deal of practice at not looking away first. You were very young, Dora said. You didn't have experience managing property. Edmund was concerned about you, about your ability to— Don't, Clara said. Dora stopped. Don't tell me it was for my benefit. Clara's voice was even. She had not raised it. She did not intend to raise it, because Dora had always been most comfortable when Clara was loud or emotional. It gave her something to manage, something to calm down, something to position herself above. Don't tell me Edmund was confused or that I wasn't capable. Don't construct a version of this that requires me to be incompetent or Edmund to be foolish. I'm asking you not to do that. Something moved across Dora's face. Not guilt, exactly. Clara was not certain Dora was built for guilt in any functional sense, but something adjacent to it. The look of a woman who has managed a situation for a very long time and has just watched the management fail. What do you want, Clara? She said, and for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, Dora sounded tired. Right now I want you to sit down, Clara said. Dora sat down. She chose the chair farthest from Colton and folded her hands on the table and composed her face back into something approaching neutral. But she sat, and Clara noted that she sat because she was asked to, not because she had chosen to, which was a different arrangement than had existed in this kitchen for 20 years. I have questions, Clara said, and I want honest answers. I can try. Honest answers, Clara repeated. Not the answers that protect the situation, not the answers that explain things in the best possible light, the ones that are true. Dora was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and the wood walls carried the sound. The farmhouse doing what it always did, indifferent to what happened inside it. Edmund told me about the document, Dora said finally. Before he filed it, he told me it was his intention. And after he died? A long pause. I found the copy in his desk. And you didn't tell me. Dora looked at the table. Her fingers were very still on the wood. No? Why not? Because— She stopped. She started again, and what came out was more honest than Clara had expected, perhaps more honest than Dora had intended. Because the boys were young, and the farm needed managing, and I didn't know how to do it without you. And if you knew, you might have left. You might have decided you didn't need to stay, and I couldn't. Her voice faltered slightly, and Clara watched the effort it took for her to pull it back. I couldn't manage without you here. The kitchen held that. Colton looked at the table in front of him with the careful non-expression of a man who is a witness and knows it. Clara let the silence run for a moment before she spoke. You couldn't manage without me, she said, so you took away my ability to leave. I didn't take anything. You withheld the information that would have allowed me to make a real choice. About staying or going, about how I lived, about what this house was to me. Clara's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. You made a decision that wasn't yours to make about my life. And then you spent 20 years benefiting from that decision. And I spent 20 years eating dinner at the table I built in a house I owned without knowing it and being grateful for the privilege. She stopped. That is taking something, Dora. That is taking 20 years. Dora's jaw tightened. For a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, going to find the angle she always found, the verbal judo that turned Clara's grievances back into management problems. And then something went out of her, some structural thing, like a beam giving way. And she just sat there, old and tired in her day dress in the kitchen that she had treated as hers for so long, and she did not argue. I know, she said. 2 words. Clara had waited 31 years for 2 words in that particular sequence, and now that they were here, they were both less and more than she had imagined. Less because they didn't fix anything, more because Dora had never said them before about anything, and Clara had not been entirely certain she was capable of it. "What happens now?" Dora asked. She looked at Colton, because looking at Clara had become too difficult. "That's for Clara to decide," Colton said. "The property is hers, has been hers for 15 years. What she chooses to do with it is entirely her choice." Dora looked back at Clara. The authority she had carried in every room of this house for 20 years, the particular gravity of a woman who has been the center of every decision, who has been deferred to and organized around and consulted on all things, was not there anymore. It was not that it had been stripped away dramatically. It had simply become apparent that it had never been fully earned, and that changes the weight of a thing considerably. "I'm not going to put you out," Clara said. She watched Dora look up with something that might have been relief, and she said it again, more clearly, so there was no confusion. "I'm not saying that to comfort you. I'm saying it because it's my choice to make, and I'm choosing it. But I'm also telling you that things will be different. That starts today." "Different how?" Dora asked quietly. "I'll tell you when I know," Clara said. "Right now I need to think." She stood up. She looked at Colton, who had been sitting across the table with his coffee going cold, who had ridden to Cheyenne and back and hired 2 attorneys and come out here on a Tuesday morning to put documents on a kitchen table and tell the truth about what was in them. He looked back at her with the same direct, unhurried attention he'd given her since the first night in the yard. "Thank you," she said. "You would have found it eventually," he said. "Maybe. But I didn't." She held his eyes. "You did." He nodded, once, accepting the gratitude without making more of it than it was. She picked up the documents from the table carefully, one by one, and held them in both hands. They were not heavy. A few sheets of paper, handwritten, dried ink on aged stock. Edmund's signature, looping and forward-leaning, committing something to her name that she had spent 15 years not knowing she had. She had cooked 3,000 meals in this kitchen. She had fixed the joist in the hallway and recaulked the windows and planted the kitchen garden and stacked the wood and mended the fences and carried this place on her back through Wyoming winters, while believing herself to be a guest who had stayed too long. She had not been a guest. She had been home. She held the documents against her chest for a moment, not dramatically. Just the way you hold something when you need to feel that it's real, when your hands need to confirm what your eyes have told you. Then she set them on the counter, squared their edges, and went back to her bread dough. Dora sat at the table and did not speak. Colton sat across from her and finished his cold coffee. Outside, the Wyoming wind came across the yard in the way it always had, flat and deliberate, finding every gap. And the farmhouse creaked around all of them, the old timbers settling into a cold they had no choice about. Clara pressed her hands into the dough and worked it. The bread would need another hour before it was ready to bake. She had known that since this morning, before any of this, and the bread did not care what had happened in this kitchen in the last 40 minutes. It needed what it needed, and she would give it that, and then she would think clearly about what came next. She already knew, in the broad strokes, what came next. She had known it, in the way you know things before you let yourself know them. Since the moment she had looked at her name on that document and understood that the ground under her feet was ground she had always been standing on. She just needed an hour with her hands in the dough before she was ready to say it out loud. The bread came out right. Clara pulled it from the oven an hour after Colton left. He had stayed long enough to answer Dora's few halting questions about the legal process, which he did with the patient precision of a man who is prepared for the conversation. And then he had taken his satchel and his cold coffee cup and gone, saying he would return in a few days, that she should take time to think, that there was no urgency in the legal sense even if everything else felt urgent. The door had closed behind him, and she had been alone with Dora in the kitchen for exactly 4 minutes before Dora retreated to the parlor, and then Clara had been alone, which was what she needed. She worked the bread out of the pan and set it on the rack and stood in the warm kitchen smell of it and let herself breathe. She had always thought better with her hands occupied. It was one of the things she knew about herself that she had never had occasion to explain to anyone, because no one had asked. All those years of early mornings and long evenings in this kitchen, the work had not just been labor. It had been the condition under which she could think clearly, the physical occupation that freed whatever it was in her that needed to be free in order to work through difficult things. She had solved problems this way. She had survived grief this way. She had endured years of small humiliations this way, working through them with her hands in flour or on fence wire, or in garden soil until they became something she could carry without bleeding. Now she needed to think through something that was not a problem to be endured but a decision to be made, which was different, and she was aware of the difference. The documents were still on the counter where she had squared them. She looked at them while the bread cooled. Edmund's signature. Her name. March 14th, 1882. She had been 32 years old. She had been here 9 years already by then, working the farm through the seasons, not thinking about ownership because ownership had not presented itself as a category that applied to her. Edmund had been alive and kind and running the property, and she had been his niece who had stayed on and made herself useful, and that had been enough of a story to live inside. She understood now that Edmund had seen something she hadn't seen herself. That he had looked at this woman who had come to him at 23 with nothing and built herself into the farm's central functioning part, and had thought, she should have this. Not because she needed rescuing, because it was right. He had done what he could. He had put it in writing, witnessed, and filed. What he hadn't been able to do was ensure that the people who came after him would honor it, and that was the part that had broken. And the breaking had been 20 years in the repairing. She ate a slice of bread at the kitchen table with butter and thought about what she was going to do. Gerald came back from town at 3 in the afternoon. She heard his wagon before she saw him, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway when he came around from the barn, coat dusty from the road, with the particular loose-shouldered look of a man who has spent the morning being Gerald Whitmore in public and is now returning to the place where he doesn't have to perform it. He saw her in the doorway and raised a hand in the half-greeting he usually gave her, the kind that acknowledges presence without committing to engagement, and then he saw her face and his hand came down. "What's wrong?" he said. "Come inside," Clara said. He came inside. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the documents on the counter, and then at Clara, and then toward the parlor where Dora had been all day, emerging only for lunch and then retreating again, which was unusual enough that Gerald had clearly noticed it even before he'd seen Clara's face. "Where's Mama?" "Parlor. She knows about this already. I wanted to tell you and Pat myself." "Tell us what?" He was looking at the documents with the cautious expression of a man who has learned that papers on kitchen tables are rarely good news. "Sit down, Gerald." He sat. She set the documents in front of him and let him read. She watched his face move through it. Confusion first, then the slower work of understanding, then something that was not quite shock, but was in the same family. He got to her name and read the section twice, and when he looked up, his face had changed in a way she hadn't seen on Gerald Whitmore before. Something had gone uncertain in it. "This is... When did you get this?" "I didn't get it. Colton Mercer found it in the county records. It's been there for 23 years. She sat down across from him. "Edmund filed it in 1882. He left this property to me." Gerald's jaw moved. She could see him searching for the angle that made this less than it was, the reframing that would restore the familiar shape of things. He was not a dishonest man, exactly, not like Dora, who had looked at the documents and gone to the parlor to compose herself around them. Gerald was a man who had simply never been required to think carefully about where his comfort came from, and careful thinking was harder when you'd been allowed to avoid it your whole life. "Mama knew?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the document again, and she could see him doing the math the same way she had done it. 15 years, 20 years of not being told. His hands on the table were still. "She should have told you," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "She should have." "I didn't know." He said it not defensively, but in the way of a man making sure the record is accurate. "I want you to know that. I never knew about any document. I believe you. But He stopped. He rubbed his face with one hand in the heavy way that men do when they're arriving somewhere they don't want to arrive. "I knew things weren't right, the way things were. I knew it wasn't. I knew you weren't treated the way you should have been." He looked at the table. "I just didn't do anything about it." Clara looked at him. This was more than she had expected from Gerald, and she gave it the weight it deserved. "No," she said. "You didn't. I'm sorry for that. I know." Pat came in an hour later and the conversation ran again, shorter and more difficult because Pat was not built for this kind of reckoning and sat through it looking at the floor. He said almost nothing, which was at least honest. Pat being quiet was more truthful than Pat producing words. He looked at his mother through the parlor doorway, and something moved across his face that might have been anger, might have been shame, might have been both fighting each other for position. When he left the kitchen, he went to the parlor and she heard him and Dora talking in low tones that she did not try to hear. She didn't need to. Whatever was being said in there was between them, and she had enough of her own to attend to. That evening, after supper, which Clara cooked because the bread and the thinking and the conversations had taken all day, and she had not gotten around to deciding yet what the new arrangements would look like, and people needed to eat regardless of the legal status of the house they ate in. She asked Dora to come to the kitchen. Dora came in and sat at the table without being told to this time. She had the look of a woman who has spent a day in a parlor rearranging her position and has arrived at something she can live with, which was the most Clara had expected, and possibly more than she deserved. "I've been thinking about what I said this morning," Clara started. "About things being different," Dora said. "Yes." Clara sat. She had thought through this carefully, not vindictively, not with the heat of the morning still in it, but with the clear-eyed practicality that she had always brought to the problems this farm presented. "I'm not asking anyone to leave. I want to be clear about that because I was clear about it this morning, and I mean it the same way now." Dora nodded. She was listening. "But this is my home, and I'm going to live in it like it's my home, which means differently than I have been living in it." Clara looked at her directly. "I'm done cooking every meal. I'm done being the one who gets up before anyone else and goes to bed after everyone else and fills in every gap because it's easier than making arrangements that share the work fairly. That ends." "All right," Dora said. The quickness of it surprised Clara slightly. She had prepared for more resistance. "Ruth can take the household meals 3 days a week. You and I can manage the others between us. Gerald and Pat can handle the heavier outdoor work. They should have been handling it for years." "Yes," Dora said. "They should have." Clara looked at her. There was something different about Dora tonight. Not broken. Dora was not a woman who broke, but reduced in some essential way, brought back to a scale that was closer to human. The authority that had filled every room she entered had not returned since this morning, and Clara did not think it was going to return, not in the same form, because authority of that kind runs on other people's uncertainty, and Clara was not uncertain anymore. "I'm also going to start using the front parlor," Clara said. A pause. The front parlor was Dora's territory, her furniture, her arrangement, her guests. Clara had sat in it perhaps a dozen times in 31 years, always as an afterthought, always briefly. "Of course," Dora said, "and I'm going to start making some decisions about the property, repairs I've been putting off, changes to the kitchen garden, conversations with the county about the road easement." She paused. "I'll consult you on things that affect everyone, but the decisions are mine." Dora looked at her hands. "Edmund would be glad," she said quietly. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I think he would." Clara did not respond to that directly, because Edmund's gladness was not what this conversation was about, and invoking him now felt like the kind of move Dora made when she needed something to soften a hard edge. Not maliciously, just habitually. "Dora," she said instead, "why did you really keep it from me?" Dora looked up. She had answered this morning with the practical explanation. She needed Clara. She couldn't manage without her. She was afraid Clara would leave. And that had been true as far as it went. But Clara had been thinking about it all day, and she did not think it was the whole truth. Dora was quiet for a long moment. "Because this house was all I had," she said, "after Edmund. The boys were grown, or nearly. I had no income of my own, no property of my own, nothing that was just mine. And if you were the owner—" She stopped. "I was afraid of what that made me." "A tenant," Clara said. "Yes, which is what I've been." The word landed in the kitchen and sat there. "Yes," Dora said, "which is what you've been. And I knew it was wrong, and I couldn't—" She pressed her lips together. "I couldn't make myself undo it. Every year it got harder to undo because more time had passed, and there was always something that needed handling, and you were always there handling it, and it was easier to not think about the document than to think about what fixing it would cost me. Clara held that. It was an honest answer. Not a good answer, not a defensible answer, but honest in the way that people manage to be honest when they've run out of the energy to be otherwise, and she gave it the acknowledgement it deserved. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. Dora looked at her with the particular expression of someone who expected punishment and has received something more complicated. "What do we do now?" she asked. "You and I. We live here," Clara said. "We figure out what that looks like. It won't look like it has. But we're not nothing to each other, Dora, whatever else is true. 31 years is 31 years. It was not forgiveness, exactly." Clara knew that, and she thought Dora knew it too. It was something more provisional, a decision to continue in proximity, to see what was possible when the false architecture had been removed and you could look at what was actually there. Maybe not much, maybe enough. She didn't know yet, and she was not going to pretend to know. Dora nodded and got up and went back to the parlor, and Clara sat in the kitchen alone for a while. Colton came back on Friday. She met him in the yard this time, having seen him from the window, and they stood in the cold near the barn the way they had stood the first night, except that everything was arranged differently now. "How did it go?" he asked. "About how you'd expect," she said. "Gerald was more decent than I thought he'd be. Pat was Pat. Dora said something true by accident, and then we talked around it for an hour. And now? And now we're figuring out the new version." She looked at the yard, the wood stack, the fence, the kitchen garden under its frost. Her wood stack. Her fence. The words felt strange in her mouth still, not because they were wrong, but because she had gone so long without being allowed to think them. "I want to talk to you about something." "All right. The timber deal with Gerald. The North Stand." Colton looked at her steadily. "What about it? Is it finalized?" "Preliminary agreement only. Full contract hasn't been signed." "Then I need to be part of that conversation," she said. "The North Timber Stand is on my property. I should have been the one you were dealing with from the start." Colton looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that might have been the closest thing he had to amusement. Not the laughing kind, just the quiet kind that lives in the corners of a person's expression when something goes the way it ought to. "You're right," he said. "You should have. I'm sorry I didn't know that when I rode out here." "You didn't know anything when you rode out here?" she said. "You found it after. That's something. What are your terms?" he asked, and the ease of it, the simple, direct assumption that she had terms, that her terms were the relevant ones, that this was a business conversation between people of equal standing, was one of the better things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She told him. She had thought about it, run the numbers the way her father had taught her, considered what the timber was worth per cord, and what access to the North Stand would cost in terms of road use and fence disruption and reseeding after. She was not a professional negotiator, but she was a woman who had been managing the practical reality of this property for 3 decades, and she knew what things cost and what they were worth. Colton listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of which were good questions, and she answered them. They went back and forth on one point, the per-cord rate, for about 10 minutes, and she did not give more ground than was fair, and he did not push for more than was fair, and they arrived at a number that was better than what Gerald had agreed to in the preliminary. "I'll have my attorney draw up the revised contract," Colton said. "Should have it out to you by end of next week." "Good." She looked at him. "I appreciate what you did. Going to Cheyenne, hiring the attorneys, that wasn't nothing." "No," he said, "it wasn't." "Why did you go to that much trouble for someone you'd met once?" He thought about it in the genuine way he had of thinking about things before he answered them, which she had already decided she appreciated. "Because I've done business in a lot of places, and I've met a lot of people who were getting a bad deal, and I've looked the other way because it wasn't my business." He looked at the farmhouse, at the repaired fence, at the straight rows of the dormant kitchen garden. "I didn't want to look the other way at this one." She held that for a moment. It was not a romantic thing he had said. It was a plain statement of a plain decision, and that was exactly why it landed the way it did. Because she had spent 31 years in proximity to people who dressed everything up in the language of family and kindness and care while doing something quite different underneath, and plain things had become precious to her. Are you going to keep coming out this way? She asked, after the contract signed. I've got other timber stands to look at in this county, he said, and I find the region suits me. He looked at her. Why? Because I'm going to need someone who knows timber, she said, and someone who can tell the difference between what's in the county records and what people are saying is in the county records. She paused. And probably someone to have coffee with occasionally who isn't related to me or afraid of me. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the architecture of one. You're not afraid of you either, he said. I noticed that early on. Someone had to not be, she said. She turned and walked back toward the house, her house, on her land, on ground that had been hers for 15 years and was now hers in the way that meant she knew it. And she heard him behind her coming up the steps, and she opened the back door and went in, and he followed, and she put the kettle on. Outside, the wind came down off the Laramie Range in the flat, deliberate way it always did, finding the gaps, moving through the yard where she had sat on a chopping block 5 days ago with her plate in her hands. The wood stack stood against the barn wall. The fence ran straight across the near pasture. The kitchen garden lay dormant under frost, waiting for spring. Everything exactly as she had left it, and nothing the same at all. She got 2 cups from the shelf and set them on the counter and waited for the water to boil. Behind her, she heard Colton settle into the chair at the kitchen table. Not the chair he'd used on Tuesday, a different one, the one by the window, which had always been the chair she sat in when she had a moment to herself, and she thought about saying something about that, and then decided she didn't mind. Some adjustments took time. Others were immediate. This one, she thought, was going to be fine. Winter settled over the Laramie Range the way it always did, without apology, without negotiation, simply arriving at full weight and staying. The roads from Cody became unreliable by mid-December, the track from the main road to the farmhouse drifting in a way that required clearing every few days. And Clara did what she had always done in December. She stocked the root cellar, checked the animals, split extra wood, and prepared for the months when the world contracted to the size of what you could see from your own windows. Except that this December was different, because the windows were hers. That sounds like a small thing. She understood from the outside that it would sound like a small thing. A legal document, a change in paperwork, a name on a county record that had always been there waiting to be read. But living inside it was not a small thing. It was the difference between sleeping in a house and sleeping in your house. And anyone who has spent years not knowing the difference, and then suddenly known it will tell you there is no way to explain it to someone who hasn't. Something in her body understood, even when her mind was occupied with other things. She woke differently. She moved through the kitchen differently. She stood at the window in the early morning dark with her coffee and looked out at the yard and felt something in her chest that was not happiness exactly, not the bright, uncomplicated kind, but something older and quieter and more durable. Something that does not need an audience. Gerald had taken the news with the slow, effortful decency she had come to expect from him. He did not argue about the property. He did not involve lawyers or contest the filing, though Colton had told her he had every right to challenge it on Dora's behalf if he chose to. He had come to her one evening in the second week of December and sat across the kitchen table and said he was going to build his family a house on the south end of the property. There was a flat section past the second fence line that had good drainage, if she was willing to sell him the parcel at a fair price. I should have done it years ago, he said. Built our own place. We should never have stayed on here the way we did. No, Clara agreed. You shouldn't have. I don't know if I can. If there's a way to... He stopped. Gerald was not a man for whom apology came naturally. The architecture of it didn't quite exist in him, not because he was cruel, but because he'd never been made to build it. I know sorry isn't enough. It's not, she said. But you're doing the right thing now, and that counts for something. It's not nothing, Gerald. They agreed on a price that was fair by the county assessor's values, and Clara put the money into the account she had opened in her own name at the Cody Bank the week after Colton brought the documents. Her own name on her own account, which she had never had, and which the bank officer had processed with a brisk efficiency that she'd found almost unbearably ordinary, this enormous thing handled as routine paperwork because for everyone else in that building it was routine. Pat left by the end of January. He had always been the less rooted of the two brothers, and the rearrangement of the household gave him the permission he had apparently needed to do what he had wanted to do for some time. He was going to Denver, he said, where a friend had work in the rail yards. He came to Clara before he left, hat in his hands, and said the thing he hadn't said in the kitchen the day the documents were on the table. I always knew something wasn't right, he said. I just didn't ask because I didn't want to know the answer. I know, Clara said. Does that make it worse? That I knew something was wrong and did nothing? She thought about it honestly, the way he deserved. Yes, she said, but it doesn't make you unfixable. Go to Denver, Pat. Do something that you can be straightforward about. He left on a Tuesday, same day of the week Colton had come with the documents, which struck her as a coincidence worth noting even if she did nothing with it. Dora was the hardest thing to navigate, and Clara did not pretend otherwise. They lived in the same house through the winter with the careful, cautious attention of two people who have renegotiated the terms of their proximity and are still learning what the new terms actually feel like day to day. There were moments that were almost comfortable. Dora had a gift for needlework that Clara had always known about, but never paid attention to, and in the evening sometimes she would work in the front parlor, which Clara now used freely, sitting in the chair by the window she had claimed without ceremony. And they would be in the same room with a lamp between them and the wind outside. And it was not easy, but it was human, which was more than it had been before. There were other moments that were simply hard. Dora had decades of habit in that house, and habit does not rewrite itself because the legal documents have changed. She still sometimes gave instructions to Clara in the tone of a woman managing a household employee, catching herself mid-sentence when she heard it, or not catching herself, and Clara would look at her steadily and say nothing, which was more effective than arguing and considerably more tiring. They were both tired in those months, in the specific way of people doing the slow work of becoming something different from what they have always been to each other, with no guarantee the thing they were becoming would be worth the effort. But they stayed at it. That was the thing. Neither of them left the field, and Clara thought there was something in that worth acknowledging, not celebrating, just acknowledging. Dora was not a villain in the way stories need villains. She was a woman who had made a bad decision in a frightened moment and had then spent 20 years maintaining it because the alternative required her to face what she'd done. And there's nothing unusual about that. Nothing rare. People do it all the time, in small ways and large ones. They make a choice they know is wrong, and then they build their whole architecture of daily life around not having to look at it directly, and the architecture gets more load-bearing every year until taking it down would bring the walls with it. Clara had no interest in collapsing Dora's walls. She just wanted to live in her own house. By March, something that was not exactly peace, but was in its general direction, had settled between them. Not warmth. Clara did not expect warmth, and she was honest enough with herself to admit she wasn't certain she could offer it either. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the uncomplicated form. But a functional regard. A recognition that they were both still here, both still standing, both trying to do the next right thing, which is all any person can reasonably ask of another. One evening in late March, Dora set a cup of tea in front of Clara without being asked, and Clara said thank you, and Dora nodded and went back to her chair, and nothing more was said about it. It was a small thing. Clara held it in her chest for a while anyway. The idea for frontier tables started in April with the mud. Spring in Wyoming came in dirty and loud. The snow went fast that year, faster than usual, and the road from the main track to the farmhouse became nearly impassable for 2 weeks while the ground decided what it was going to do. During those 2 weeks, Clara was effectively homebound, which she used as most farmers use bad weather confinement. She worked on the things inside that she had been putting off, and she thought. She had the timber contract income coming. Colton's crew would begin work on the North Stand in June, and the first payment was already in her account in Cody. She had the money from Gerald's parcel purchase, which was more than she'd expected given what a fair price turned out to be when she was the one setting it. She had, for the first time in her life, capital, which is the word for money that is not just enough to survive on, but enough to do something with. She thought about what to do with it for 2 weeks in the mud, and what she kept coming back to was the thing she had always been best at, the thing that was most completely hers, the thing that no one had ever thought to take credit for, even when they took credit for everything else. She could cook. Not in the way that anyone with a kitchen and enough years in it can cook, in the particular, specific, disciplined way that makes people close their eyes on the first bite. She had known this about herself for a long time. In the modest, unspoken way, you know things about yourself when no one has ever said them out loud to you. The Thanksgiving meal. Every Thanksgiving meal, 31 of them, and the Christmas dinners and the harvest suppers, and the daily feeding of a household for 3 decades. She had developed a vocabulary in that kitchen that was as real as any professional training, built from repetition and intuition, and the particular education of cooking for people who would notice immediately if something was wrong, but would never comment when it was right. She had thought, over the years, about what it might mean to cook for people who chose to be there. Not obligation food, not survival food, chosen food, the kind people ride a distance for, the kind that becomes what they tell their families about when they come home. She started with the room off the kitchen. It had been used for storage, old furniture, broken equipment waiting to be repaired or disposed of, boxes of Edmund's papers that no one had gone through in 15 years. She cleared it herself over the course of a week, which was harder physical work than she'd anticipated and left her back complaining for 3 days. And she did not ask anyone for help because the deciding was hers, and so was the doing. When it was empty, she stood in it and measured it with her eye. 8 people, comfortably. 10 if she set it tight. Not a restaurant in any formal sense, just a room with tables where people could sit and be fed. She told Colton about it in May, when he came out to walk the timber stand before his crew arrived. He listened to the whole thing, walking beside her through the greening property with his hands in his coat pockets, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than preparing to object. "What are you going to call it?" he asked. She had not thought about a name. She thought about it now, walking beside him through the spring grass. "Frontier table," she said. It came out fully formed, the way things sometimes do when they've been assembled somewhere below the level of conscious thought and are simply waiting to be named. "That's a good name," he said. "What do you need?" 2 tables to start, 4 chairs each. I'll use the kitchen as it is. The stove is big enough." She paused. "Someone to spread the word in Cody. I don't have connections in town the way I should." "I have connections in town," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to do my advertising." "I know. I'm offering." He looked back at her. "There's a difference." She held his eyes for a moment. The spring around them was doing what spring does, filling in the bare places, methodically and without drama, the way necessary things happen when the conditions are finally right. "All right," she said. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Wait and see if anyone comes." People came. Not immediately. Not the first weekend she opened the room, when she served 4 travelers who had stopped because their horses needed water, and they'd smelled the kitchen through the open window and asked hesitantly if there was food available. But those 4 told someone, and that someone told someone else, and by the second month she was turning people away on Saturdays because she didn't have the room. It was not effortless. She wants to be clear about that, even in memory, because the story of a thing working out has a way of smoothing over what the working out actually costs. She was 54 years old and running a kitchen at a pace she had not run one before. Not as household labor, which is relentless but irregular, but as a business, which is relentless and scheduled and financially consequential when you are the one whose money is in it. There were weeks when she was so tired by Saturday evening that she sat at the kitchen table after the last guest left and could not immediately stand back up. There were supply problems in the early months when she couldn't always get what she needed from town and had to revise menus on the day of. There was a week in August when a shipment of bad flour came from the supplier and she lost 3 days of baking and had to explain to guests who had ridden 40 miles that there was no bread this week, which was one of the more humbling conversations she had had in recent memory. But the food was real. That part was not complicated. The biscuits were real, and the roasted meats were real, and the pies were real in the way that things made with decades of practice and genuine attention are real, and people could tell. They could always tell. That is the most honest thing she could say about it. Not that she was brilliant or gifted or any of the words that people attached to her work as Frontier Table's reputation grew, but that she had put 31 years into a kitchen, and the kitchen had given her back something she could now give to other people, and other people recognized it for what it was. By fall, Travelers were riding 2 hours from Cody specifically. By the following spring, she had to add a second room. She hired a girl from a neighboring farm named Jessie, 16 and quick-minded, who had been looking for work and who turned out to have better instincts about hospitality than people twice her age. Clara taught her what she knew about the kitchen without making her learn it the way Clara had learned, quietly, without acknowledgement, as though the knowledge were seeping through the walls rather than being deliberately given. She told Jessie directly what she was doing and why, and Jessie looked at her with the frank attention of someone who is being treated as capable for the first time and intends to prove the assessment correct. "You're actually teaching me," Jessie said once, about 3 months in. "That's the idea," Clara said. "The woman I worked for before, she showed me things, but she never explained why. I was supposed to just absorb it." "Absorbing works," Clara said. "Teaching works faster." She handed Jessie a paring knife and a basket of apples. "Thin slices. The skin stays on." Yes. Colton was there through all of it, which is the accurate way to put it. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes require their secondary characters to announce their presence and their significance. He was simply around, riding out from Cody on Thursdays more often than not, staying for supper, sometimes staying to help with the kind of work that required more than one set of hands, a fence repair or moving the heavy furniture when she reorganized the dining room in December. He had extended his operations in the county and had legitimate reasons to be in the area frequently, and they both understood that legitimate reasons and chosen reasons are not mutually exclusive. He was not a demonstrative man. She was not a demonstrative woman. They had between them a combined century of hard living and very little practice at softness, and neither of them was inclined to perform an emotion they weren't ready for. What they had instead was something more useful in the daily run of things, a comfort in each other's company that required no maintenance, a respect that was not performed, a willingness to say things plainly and hear things plainly that is rarer than it sounds when you have spent your life around people who communicate primarily through implication and silence. One evening in the 2nd October, after the last guest had gone and Jessie had gone home and the kitchen was clean, Colton sat at the table with his coffee and watched Clara go through the week's accounts. She was good at the accounts. Her father had taught her well, and 31 years of running a household's finances, even when she had no legal standing to do so, had kept the skill sharp. "You're doing well," he said. "Financially. Better than you thought." "Better than I let myself project," she said, not looking up from the ledger. "I was conservative on purpose. I didn't want to plan for something that might not happen. That makes sense. It also means I'm further ahead than my plans account for." She set the pen down and looked at him. "I'm thinking about the east pasture. There's drainage that could be improved, and if I fixed it, I could lease the grazing to Hartwell's operation, not Chester Hartwell, his son, who is considerably more reasonable than his father." Colton looked at her with that quiet thing at the corners of his eyes. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "I think about a lot of things," she said. "I know you do." She looked at him across the table, this man who had pulled into her yard on a November evening with a timber deal and a habit of noticing things and had chosen, by some combination of decency and stubbornness, not to look away from what he saw. She thought about what it meant that he was still here. Not romantically, not in the way she might have thought about it at 30. She was 55 years old, and romance was not the category she was working in. Something more durable, something that had been tested by proximity and ordinariness and difficulty and had not gone brittle. "Colton," she said. What are you planning to do, going forward, with the operations here?" He looked at his coffee. "I've been thinking about establishing a permanent base in the county," he said, "rather than running everything out of Cody. There's enough work here to justify it." "A permanent base," she said. "Something like that." She held his gaze. "You could build on the north corner of the property," she said, "past the timber stand. There's a good flat section with a water source. I'd sell it at fair price." He was quiet for a moment. "That would put me on your property. Adjacent to my property. It would be yours." She paused. "Unless you'd rather not be adjacent." "I'd rather," he said. He said it simply, without flourish, the way he said everything, and it was exactly right for that reason. "Then we'll work out the terms," she said, and opened her ledger to a fresh page. The hardest part of any life. And this is the thing Clara understood now that she had not understood at 23 or 30 or even 40, is not the suffering. People overestimate how much the suffering is the hard part. The suffering is loud. It announces itself. It is, in its way, almost easy to attend to because it leaves you no choice. The hard part is the long middle. The years when nothing dramatic is happening, but the shape of your life is being formed anyway, day by day, by the small choices you make and the small surrenders you agree to, and the slow accumulation of mornings when you get up and do the work in front of you without asking whether the work is building something you chose or something you were too tired or too afraid to refuse. The hard part is staying awake to your own life when it is most convenient to sleep through it. She had slept through 31 years of it. She did not say this to condemn herself. She understood now the conditions that had produced that sleep, understood them with a clarity she could not have had while inside them. You cannot always see the water you're swimming in, but she was awake now, and the difference was not nothing. On the first anniversary of Thanksgiving, a year after the cold yard and the plate and the man who had pulled his wagon up to her barn and refused to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen, Clara set a table for 14 people, travelers, neighbors, Jessie and her family, Colton. Dora, who had remained in the farmhouse through the year with the cautious, effortful dignity of a woman relearning her own scale. Gerald and Ruth and their children, who had moved into their new house on the south parcel in July and were still finding the rhythm of their own household, Ruth visibly more herself in a space that was finally hers to manage. Clara cooked for 2 days. Not because she had to. Jessie could handle most of it now, and did, and Clara let her handle it without standing over her shoulder correcting things. But because she wanted to. Because there is a difference between cooking because no one else will, and cooking because the food matters to you, and the people eating it matter to you, and the act of making something good for the people around your table is, in fact, what you would choose to do with your time if you were allowed to choose. She had been allowed to choose now for a year. She was still learning what that felt like. The table was loud in the way of real gatherings, contested, occasionally too warm, one of Gerald's children spilling something that required attention, Jessie's younger brother asking questions about everything with the aggressive curiosity of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned that not every thought needs to be voiced. Dora sat at one end with her needlework composure and ate the food that Clara had made and said, midway through the meal, in a voice that was not loud but was clear enough to carry, that it was the best she'd had in years. Clara looked at her from across the table. Dora was looking at her plate, not at Clara, in the manner of a woman who has said something that cost her something and is not going to compound it by watching for the reaction. "Thank you, Dora," Clara said. Dora nodded. She cut a piece of her turkey and ate it. That was all. That was enough. Colton was beside Clara in the way he had come to be beside her, not announced, not made into anything it didn't need to be, just present in the way that solid things are present. He ate 2 helpings of everything and said very little at the table, which was his way. And when the meal was done and the noise of cleanup had replaced the noise of eating, he sat in the chair by the kitchen window. Her chair, which had ceased to be her chair exclusively sometime in the past year without either of them marking the moment, and drank his coffee and watched her move through the kitchen with the particular ease of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be. She knew he was watching. She had come to know his attention the way you come to know a sound in a house you've lived in long enough. Not intrusive, just present. Evidence of someone paying honest attention. Outside, the Laramie Range was putting its winter down the way it always did, flat and deliberate and without negotiation. The kitchen was warm. The table was loud with the last of the gathering. The farmhouse timbers settled around all of them in the familiar way of old wood in cold weather, making the small sounds of a building that has been standing a long time and intends to go on standing. Clara had set this table. She had built it, in every sense that mattered, with her hands and her years and her refusal, in the end, to accept that the life she was living was the one she had actually chosen. She had not saved herself in any dramatic way. She had not escaped. She had simply stopped agreeing to a smaller version of her own life, and the stopping had required more courage than anything else she had ever done, and no one had been there to applaud it, and it had been worth everything it cost. That is the thing that does not fit easily into stories but is true anyway. The most important thing you will ever do is probably not going to look important when you're doing it. It will look like a woman setting down her plate, like a woman saying, "I'm not eating outside," like a woman who has been told she has nowhere to go, deciding that she is going to stay exactly where she is and see what that amounts to. It amounts to this: to a warm kitchen and a full table and a year of chosen work and a chair by the window that someone who respects you has started to share. It amounts to your name on a deed and your money in an account and your door open to people who come because they choose to, not because they have to. It amounts to knowing, finally and without needing anyone to confirm it, that you were always worth more than the way you were treated, and that the only person who needed to believe that first was you. Clara Whitmore looked at her table and her kitchen and the people around both, and she felt the thing she had been missing for 31 years without knowing precisely what she was missing. She felt at home, not because anything was perfect, because it was hers.